There is a specific kind of silence that falls when an apex predator enters a room of unsuspecting prey. The men at table 4 thought they held the power. They were loud, clad in bespoke Armani, swirling $2,000 Bordeaux, and openly mocking the quiet, imposing Italian man sitting across from them. They assumed he was just another foreign investor with deep pockets and poor English. They didn't know he was a ghost from Palermo, a man whose name made entire syndicates tremble, and they certainly didn't expect the exhausted waitress pouring their water to be the only person in the room who understood the brutal, whispered death threat slipping from his lips. The air inside L'Orchidée, Manhattan's most unapologetically pretentious Michelin-starred restaurant, always smelled faintly of white truffles, polished silver, and old money. For Claire Rossi, it smelled like exhaustion. It was a Tuesday evening in November, the rain outside slicking the pavements of Lexington Avenue into dark mirrors, and Claire was already 7 hours into a double shift. Her feet ached in her sensible black shoes, her white apron was tied ruthlessly tight around her waist, and her patience for the city's elite was wearing dangerously thin. Table 4 was the undisputed center of gravity in the dining room that night. It had been booked under the name Baron Carmichael, a senior partner at a notoriously aggressive private equity firm known for buying up distressed European assets. Baron was a man who spoke too loudly, drank too fast, and treated service staff like furniture. Beside him sat his 2 associates, Paxton Davis and Jared Finch, carbon copies in navy blue suits with slicked back hair and a shared sneer of perpetual superiority. But it wasn't the Americans who drew Claire's attention. It was the 2 men sitting opposite them. The first was a mountain of a man, his face a map of hardened tissue and flat, unforgiving eyes. He was clearly a bodyguard. But the man beside him, the focal point of the American's boisterous pitching, was entirely still. Alessandro Conti did not look like the caricatures of mafia bosses that Hollywood sold. There were no flashy pinky rings, no loud pinstripes, no cigars hanging from his lips. He wore a charcoal Brioni suit that fit with devastating precision. His dark hair was threaded with premature silver at the temples, and his face was sharp, aristocratic, and completely devoid of expression. He looked like a CEO, an aristocrat, or perhaps a bored prince. But there was something in his eyes, a cold, dead-eyed stillness that made Claire's breath hitch the first time she approached the table to pour the sparkling water. Between the 2 factions sat Tommy, an anxious, sweating corporate translator hired by Baron's firm. Tommy spoke flawless, textbook Italian, the kind learned in Florentine academies and Milanese boardrooms. "Tell him," Baron barked, jabbing a thick finger onto the blueprints spread out next to the bread plates, "that our offer for the Bagheria coastline is double what the local municipality is offering. He signs the land over to Oakmont Capital. We build the luxury resort, and he gets his 20% cut of the annual gross. It's free money. Tell him he'd be an idiot to pass it up." Tommy swallowed hard, adjusting his glasses. He turned to Alessandro and began speaking in rapid, polite Italian. "Signor Conti, il signor Carmichael dice che l'offerta per la costa di Bagheria è molto vantaggiosa." Alessandro did not look at Tommy. He did not look at the blueprints. He stared directly at Baron, his black eyes unblinking. He slowly brought a crystal glass of Barolo to his lips, took a sip, and set it down without making a sound. "He's not saying anything," Paxton muttered, leaning back and crossing his arms. "Does the guy even understand what $1 billion valuation is? Look at him. He's probably just some local thug who inherited a deed." "Keep your voice down," Jared hissed nervously. "They say his family runs half of Sicily." "Please," Baron scoffed, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. The Italian Mafia is a relic. They're glorified olive oil salesmen. We're offering to drag his backward little island into the 21st century. If he doesn't take the deal, we'll just bribe the regional magistrate and take it through eminent domain. He doesn't have a choice." Claire stood a few feet away, holding a silver tray of amuse-bouche, her heart hammering against her ribs. She kept her eyes downcast, stepping forward seamlessly to place the delicate porcelain plates before the men. As she leaned over to set a plate in front of Alessandro, she felt the sheer, radiating coldness of him. He smelled of bergamot, expensive leather, and something metallic, like the air right before a thunderstorm. "Thank you, sweetheart." Baron dismissed her without a glance. "Now, Tommy, tell our silent friend here that my patience is running out. We have a flight to Tokyo tomorrow. I want the signature tonight." Tommy wiped his brow with a linen napkin. "Signor Conte, vi prego di considerare l'urgenza." Alessandro raised a single hand, just 2 fingers lifted into the air. The table went dead silent. The bodyguard, who had been perfectly still, shifted his weight just a fraction of an inch. Claire, who was turning to leave, felt an invisible tether snap taut in the room. She paused by the waiter's station, pretending to organize silverware, unable to tear herself away. Alessandro finally spoke. The sound of his voice was startling. It was a low, gravelly baritone, but it wasn't the melodic, rolling Italian that Tommy had been speaking. It was harsh, guttural, and deeply rhythmic. The consonants were sharp, the vowels clipped. Tommy blinked, his face going pale. I beg your pardon, Signor Conti? Could you repeat that in standard Italian?" Alessandro stared at the translator with absolute contempt. He spoke again, faster this time, the words biting and raw. Baron slammed his hand on the table. "What is he saying, Tommy? Translate!" I can't, sir," Tommy stammered, his hands shaking. "He's not speaking Italian. I mean, he is, but it's a dialect. It's Sicilian, but a very heavy, localized version. Palermitano, perhaps, mixed with something older. I don't know the vocabulary. He's using idioms." "You're a useless idiot, Tommy," Baron snarled. He turned to Alessandro, raising his voice and speaking slowly, as if the man were deaf. "Sign the paper. You make money. Good money. Yes?" Alessandro's jaw tightened. The faint shadow of a truly terrifying smile touched the corner of his lips. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. And he spoke again. Claire stood frozen by the service station. The silverware in her hand felt heavy. She knew those words. She hadn't heard them in 15 years, not since her grandfather, Vincenzo Rossi, had died in a tiny, cramped apartment in Queens. Vincenzo had fled Palermo in the early 90s during the Second Mafia War, carrying nothing but a suitcase and a terrifying secret. He had refused to teach Claire's mother standard Italian, claiming it was the language of the North, the language of the people who looked down on them. Instead, he had spoken to Claire exclusively in the ancient, localized dialect of his village, a language of the earth, of blood feuds and of survival. Claire listened to the low, rasping words coming from Alessandro Conti's mouth. "Ci si sunnu scecci ci vonu fari iliuni. Dici achistica l'usuli non nasci piiddi. Esistu porcu toccare a me terra cui so irita sporchi, ci tagiui manu e ci fazzu manciari." Tommy was frantically flipping through a translation app on his phone under the table. He said something about lions and the sun. "Sir, I think it's a metaphor." "I don't care about metaphors," Baron shouted, his face turning red, drawing the ire of the maitre d' across the room. "Tell him if he doesn't sign, I will personally see to it that his family's estates are tied up in international court for the next decade. I will ruin him." Alessandro's eyes darkened. He slowly reached inside his suit jacket. Jared gasped, pushing his chair back. The bodyguard took a half step forward, but Alessandro only pulled out a silver DuPont lighter. He flicked it open, the sharp clink echoing like a gunshot, and stared at the flame. He was completely unfazed by Baron's outburst. He was waiting. Claire looked at the arrogance on Baron's face. She looked at the absolute, quiet lethality in Alessandro's posture. She knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that Baron Carmichael had no idea how close he was to death. The men he was dealing with didn't use international courts. They used car bombs. They used concrete. Before she could stop herself, before her rational mind could remind her of her rent, her job, and her safety. Claire stepped away from the service station. She walked directly up to table 4. "Excuse me," Claire said softly, her voice cutting through the heavy tension. Baron glared at her. "What do you want? We don't need anything." "Go away." Claire ignored him. She turned her body slightly, directing her gaze entirely at Alessandro Conti. The mob boss looked up at her, a flicker of mild irritation in his dark eyes at the interruption. Claire took a breath. She let the soft, melodic American English drop away from her tongue, reaching deep into the memories of her grandfather's kitchen. "I giudici cacisti l'omini di carta non fanno scantare a nudo," Claire said. Her voice was steady, the guttural Sicilian dialect flowing from her lips with perfect, authentic cadence. "He says that paper men do not frighten anyone." The effect was instantaneous. The bodyguard's hand shot to his hip, his eyes wide, suddenly assessing Claire not as a waitress, but as a threat. Tommy dropped his phone. Baron and his associates stared at her in stunned silence. But it was Alessandro's reaction that made the air leave Claire's lungs. The man froze, the silver lighter in his hand extinguished. His dark, dead eyes snapped up to meet hers, and for the first time all evening, the mask slipped. Shock, sharp and unfiltered, flashed across his aristocratic features. He looked at her, really looked at her, taking in her cheap uniform, her exhausted face, and the dark, unmistakably Mediterranean features she had inherited from her mother. "What the hell did you just say?" Baron demanded, looking between Claire and Alessandro. "You speak Italian?" "She isn't speaking standard Italian," Tommy whispered, staring at Claire with awe. "She's speaking his dialect." Alessandro slowly leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Claire's. The dangerous tension in his shoulders shifted into something else, intense, predatory curiosity. "Così tu?" Alessandro asked her softly. "Who are you?" "Una camerera," Claire replied evenly, keeping her face blank. "A waitress." A low, dark chuckle rumbled in Alessandro's chest. It was a terrifying sound. He gestured toward Baron with a flick of his chin, still looking at Claire. "Traduci zoku, dissi prima," Alessandro commanded softly. "Translate what I said before." Claire turned to Baron. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might break her ribs, but her voice was ice cold. "Mr. Conti says that you are donkeys trying to be lions," Claire translated into perfect, crisp English. Paxton choked on his wine. Baron's face turned violently purple. "Excuse me?" "He also said," Claire continued, her eyes shifting to the blueprints on the table, "that the sun doesn't rise for you, and if you," she looked directly at Baron, "touch his land again with your dirty fingers, he will cut off your hands and force you to eat them." The silence that followed was absolute. It was thick enough to choke on. Baron's mouth opened and closed. He looked at Tommy, who was violently nodding, terrified. He looked at the massive bodyguard. Finally, he looked at Alessandro. Alessandro raised his glass of Barolo to Baron, a mocking, elegant toast, his eyes glinting with lethal amusement. "You," Baron stammered, his bravado entirely shattered, replaced by a sudden, dawning terror. He realized, finally, that he wasn't sitting across from a businessman. "You can't threaten me. I'm a partner at Oakmont. We're in New York." "Nova York, Palermo, a morti non canusci confini," Alessandro murmured to Claire, his voice a velvet threat. "He says," Claire translated, her voice barely a whisper, "New York, Palermo. Death knows no borders." Baron stood up so fast his chair tipped over, crashing onto the hardwood floor. Heads turned all over the restaurant. "We're leaving," he rasped, grabbing his briefcase. "Paxton Jared, we're done here. The deal is off." The three Americans practically tripped over themselves, rushing toward the exit, Tommy scurrying behind them like a frightened mouse. Claire stood at the empty table, her hands trembling. She had done it. She had intervened in a mafia dispute, insulted a billionaire, and likely cost the restaurant thousands of dollars. She looked down at Alessandro Conti. He was alone at the table with his bodyguard. He calmly picked up the torn corner of the real estate contract, struck his silver lighter, and set the paper on fire, dropping it onto the bread plate. He looked up at Claire through the smoke. "Come ti chiami?" he asked. "What is your name?" "Claire," she said in English. "Claire Rossi." Alessandro's eyes flickered at the surname. A dangerous, knowing light sparked in his gaze. Rossi was common, but in the circles of Palermo, specific Rossis meant specific things. "Claire Rossi." He tested her name on his tongue, his accent thick and intoxicating. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a stack of $100 bills, and dropped them onto the table. It was easily $5,000. "Preparami l'ukuntu, e tenilu restu pichirida," he said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "Get me the bill, and keep the change, little one." Before Claire could say another word, the Sicilian boss turned and walked out of the restaurant, the shadows seemingly parting to let him through. The firing was spectacular, loud, and incredibly brief. Gregory, the general manager of L'Orchidée, was a man whose entire personality was built around appeasing the rich. When Baron Carmichael called from his town car threatening to ruin the restaurant's reputation, Gregory nearly had a stroke. "You are a waitress, Claire, a ghost. You do not speak to the guests, you do not translate for the guests, and you certainly do not deliver death threats to hedge fund managers," Gregory screamed in the stainless steel kitchen, spittle flying from his lips. "Clear out your locker. You're done. And don't even think about keeping that tip. That's going straight into the register to cover the walkout." Claire didn't argue. She felt a strange, detached numbness. She untied her apron, draped it over a chair, and walked to the staff room. She took her coat, her cheap handbag, and walked out the back service door into the cold, damp alleyway. The rain had intensified, freezing drops cutting through her thin trench coat. She hugged herself, shivering, the adrenaline of the last hour finally crashing down. She had no job. Rent was due in 4 days. Her mother's medical bills were piling up on the kitchen counter at home. She had let her pride and a stupid, visceral connection to a language she hadn't spoken in a decade ruin her life. She walked toward the mouth of the alley, aiming for the subway station on 53rd Street. But she didn't make it to the street. A massive figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking to the narrow exit. Claire stopped dead, her heart leaping into her throat. It was the bodyguard. Up close, the scars on his face were pale and jagged, and his eyes were completely dead. "Miss Rossi," the man said, in heavily accented English. His voice sounded like grinding stones. "My boss wishes to speak with you." I have nothing to say to him," Claire stammered. taking a step back, her mind racing. I translated his message. I got fired for it. We're even. Tell him to leave me alone. It was not a request, the bodyguard said softly. A sleek black Maybach pulled up to the curb at the end of the alley, its tires hissing against the wet asphalt. The rear door clicked open, seemingly on its own. The interior was pitch black, a cavern of leather and shadows. "Get in, Miss Rossi," the bodyguard instructed, gesturing toward the car. Claire looked around frantically. The alley was empty. The street beyond was quiet. Screaming would do no good against men like this. She took a deep breath, her grandfather's voice echoing in her head. "Never show the wolves that you are bleeding." She walked past the giant, her spine rigid, and slid into the back of the Maybach. The door slammed shut behind her, sealing her in a soundproof vault. The air inside was warm, smelling of that same intoxicating blend of bergamot and danger. Alessandro Conti was sitting in the far corner, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid resting on his knee. The faint, ambient light from the street lamps outside illuminated the sharp angles of his face. He looked at her in silence for a long time as the car smoothly pulled away from the curb. "You lost your job," Alessandro said. His English was suddenly perfect, entirely devoid of the thick, broken accent he had been faking in the restaurant. It was smooth, educated, and chillingly precise. Claire blinked in shock. You speak English?" "Fluently," Alessandro replied, taking a sip of his drink. "I was educated at Oxford. I find that when Americans believe I cannot understand them, they reveal their true, arrogant nature. It makes negotiating much simpler." "You played them," Claire whispered, a spark of anger cutting through her fear. "You sat there and let them insult you, let Tommy sweat, let me lose my job just for a power play." "I did not ask you to intervene, Claire Rossi," Alessandro pointed out smoothly. "You chose to step into a predator's cage. I am merely curious as to why." "Because I couldn't stand listening to them talk to you like you were garbage," Claire snapped back, surprising herself with her venom. "And because I hated watching you sit there and take it." Alessandro's eyes flared in the darkness. A heavy silence settled between them, charged with an electricity that made Claire's skin prickle. "Your accent," Alessandro said softly, shifting the topic, his voice dropping into a register that felt intimately dangerous. "It is pure, uncorrupted. Not the bastardized Sicilian the diaspora speaks in Brooklyn. It is the dialect of the hills above Corleone. Specifically, the Western Ridge." Claire swallowed hard, looking out the tinted window at the blurring city lights. "My grandfather taught me. He came over in the 90s. "Vincenzo Rossi," Alessandro stated. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. Claire whipped her head around, her blood turning to ice. "How do you know that name?" Alessandro set his glass down on a small silver tray. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them until Claire could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "Because, Piccerida," Alessandro murmured, his eyes locking onto hers, dark and fathomless. 32 years ago, Vincenzo Rossi stole $3 million in untraceable bearer bonds from my father's safe in Palermo, shot my uncle in the chest to escape, and vanished into the wind. Claire stopped breathing. "For 3 decades my family has looked for the Rossi bloodline," Alessandro continued, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I came to New York to deal with arrogant real estate developers. I did not expect the ghost of my family's greatest betrayer to walk up to my table and translate my own death threats." Claire pressed herself against the leather door, her mind spinning wildly. Her grandfather, the quiet, sad man who made her pasta and taught her old songs. A thief? A murderer? "I don't know what you're talking about," Claire choked out. "My grandfather was a baker. He had nothing." "He was a soldato," Alessandro corrected her smoothly. "A soldier. And a traitor. In my world, Claire, blood pays for blood. The debts of the father are the debts of the child, or in this case, the grandchild." He reached out, his large, warm hand suddenly grasping her chin. His grip was firm but not painful, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. "By all laws of the Cosa Nostra, I should have Dante take you to the docks right now," Alessandro whispered, his thumb lightly brushing against her jawline, an action that was completely at odds with his terrifying words. "Then why am I in this car?" Claire asked, her voice trembling, though she refused to break eye contact. Alessandro's gaze flickered down to her lips, then back up to her eyes. The coldness in his expression fractured, revealing something much darker, much more complex, and deeply unsettling. "Because," Alessandro said softly, "when you spoke to me in the language of my home, with fire in your eyes and a spine made of steel, I realized that killing you would be a tragic waste." He released her chin and sat back. "You owe me a debt, Claire Rossi, and you are going to pay it." "How?" Claire whispered. Alessandro smiled, a genuine, terrifying curve of his lips. "You are going to work for me." The morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Tribeca penthouse was a cold, unforgiving grey. Claire woke up in a bed the size of a small swimming pool, the 800 thread-count Egyptian cotton sheets feeling like ice against her skin. For 3 disorienting seconds, she thought the previous night was a stress-induced nightmare. Then she saw the dress. Draped meticulously over a velvet chaise lounge was a dark emerald gown, and resting on the glass nightstand was a crisp, white envelope with her name written in sharp, elegant cursive. Claire sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs. The events of the previous evening crashed over her. The restaurant, the translation, the terrifying ride in the Maybach, and Alessandro Conti's cold revelation. Her grandfather, Vincenzo, the man who had taught her how to bake bread and speak the ancient tongue of the Sicilian hills, was a thief and a murderer who had stolen $3 million from the most dangerous syndicate in Palermo. She pushed the covers off and walked to the nightstand, her hands trembling as she tore open the envelope. Inside was a single piece of thick, watermarked paper. It was a receipt from Mount Sinai Hospital. Her breath hitched. The suffocating $60,000 medical debt her mother had accumulated over 2 years of aggressive chemotherapy was gone. The balance read 0. At the bottom of the page, scrawled in black ink, was a single sentence. "The past is a debt. The future is a negotiation." Breakfast is on the terrace. Anger, hot and blinding, flared in Claire's chest. She threw the paper onto the bed, marched to the heavy oak double doors of the bedroom, and threw them open. The penthouse was a monument to silent, lethal wealth. Dark marble floors, minimalist Italian leather furniture, and a panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline that made the city look like a toy model. Dante, the massive bodyguard from the restaurant, was standing near the elevator banks. He didn't flinch as Claire stormed past him, wearing only the plush hotel-style robe she had found in the bathroom. She found Alessandro on the terrace. He was sitting at a glass table overlooking the Hudson River, wearing a tailored navy suit minus the jacket, his sleeves rolled up to reveal a jagged white scar cutting across his left forearm. He was reading the Financial Times and drinking a small espresso. "You don't own me," Claire said, her voice shaking with rage. She slammed the hospital receipt onto the glass table. "You don't get to buy my mother's life and use it as a leash. I'll pay you back. I'll work 3 jobs. I'll get a loan." Alessandro didn't look up from his newspaper. He took a slow sip of his espresso. "You are a waitress with a high school diploma and zero collateral, Claire. No bank will give you $60,000. And even if they did, you owe me $3 million, plus 32 years of interest. The hospital bill was merely a gesture of hospitality." "Hospitality?" Claire let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh. "You kidnapped me." "I offered you a ride," Alessandro corrected smoothly, finally lowering the paper. His dark eyes locked onto hers, stripping away her bravado in an instant. "And I offered you a job, a very specific, highly compensated job. I am not a criminal. I don't hurt people. And I won't help you hurt people." Alessandro leaned forward, interlacing his fingers. "I do not need you to pull a trigger, Claire. I have an army of men like Dante for that. I need your mind. I need your ear." He gestured for her to sit. Reluctantly, feeling the cold marble through her bare feet, she sank into the chair opposite him. "My family is transitioning," Alessandro explained, his voice dropping into that quiet, dangerous register. "We are moving our assets from the old world into the new. Private equity, real estate, tech infrastructure. But the old guard in Sicily, the men my father bled with, they do not trust the new ways. They speak in codes. They use the ancient dialects of the western ridges to plan, to scheme, and to betray. My standard translators cannot catch the nuances. They hear a conversation about the olive harvest. I know it is a conversation about a shipment." Claire swallowed hard. "And you think I can?" "Your grandfather was Vincenzo Rossi," Alessandro said, a dark respect edging into his tone. "He was a capodecina, a captain. He knew every cipher, every idiom, every hidden meaning in the Palermitano dialect, and he taught it all to you. Last night, you translated a death threat with the exact regional syntax of my home village. You are a ghost, Claire. No one in my world knows your face. To them, you will just be my beautiful, vapid American companion. But in reality, you will be my wiretap. And if I say no?" Alessandro's expression didn't change, but the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Then Dante drives you back to your cramped apartment in Queens. You go back to serving arrogant men like Baron Carmichael. But the debt remains. And the men in Sicily who are hunting the Rossi bloodline? I will no longer protect you from them." It was an impossible choice, and they both knew it. He had boxed her in flawlessly. He had saved her mother, threatened her life, and offered her protection all in the same breath. "What exactly do I have to do?" Claire asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. A slow, predatory smile spread across Alessandro's face. "Tonight, you put on the green dress. We are attending a gala. And you are going to listen very, very closely." For the next 8 hours, Claire was thrust into a dizzying transformation. A team of silent, efficient stylists arrived at the penthouse. They tailored the emerald silk gown to her exact measurements, styled her dark hair into sleek, cascading waves, and applied makeup that accentuated the sharp, Mediterranean angles of her face. When she finally looked in the mirror, the exhausted waitress was gone. Staring back at her was a woman who looked like she belonged on the arm of a billionaire, dangerous, elegant, and untouchable. When she walked into the living room that evening, Alessandro was waiting by the door, dressed in a flawless black tuxedo. He turned, and for a fraction of a second, his legendary composure slipped. His eyes darkened, raking over her from the slit in her gown to the diamond choker around her neck. It wasn't a look of appreciation, it was a look of possession. "Remember the rules," Alessandro murmured as he offered her his arm. His proximity made her skin burn. "You do not speak Italian tonight. You are Claire from Ohio. You smile, you drink champagne, and you listen to Damien Fabrizi." "Who is he?" Claire asked, stepping into the private elevator. "An old friend of my father's," Alessandro replied, the word friend sounding like a curse. "And the man I believe is planning to kill me." The Pierre Hotel Grand Ballroom was a sea of velvet, diamonds, and dangerous men hiding behind polite smiles. The charity gala was ostensibly to raise funds for Italian-American heritage foundations, but Claire quickly realized it was a summit. The room was divided by invisible, lethal borders. As Claire walked in on Alessandro's arm, the entire room seemed to shift. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Eyes tracked their every movement. Claire felt a cold sweat prickling at her spine, but she kept her chin high, projecting a hollow confidence she didn't feel. "Relax," Alessandro commanded softly, his lips barely moving as he smiled for a photographer. "Your heart is beating so hard I can feel it through my jacket." "I'm surrounded by the Mafia," Claire hissed back, pasting a dazzling smile on her face. "Forgive me if I'm not entirely zen." "You are surrounded by businessmen," he corrected, leading her toward the bar. "The Mafia is in the basement." Before Claire could process the dark joke, a man detached himself from a group near the ice sculpture. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a thick shock of white hair and a face deeply tanned and lined like old leather. He wore a tuxedo, but he moved with the heavy, rolling gait of a butcher. "Sandro!" the man boomed, opening his arms wide. "Figlio mio!" "Damien," Alessandro replied smoothly, stepping forward to accept the embrace. It looked warm, but Claire noticed Alessandro kept his hands outside of Damien's arms, controlling the space. "And who is this vision?" Damien asked, turning his predatory eyes on Claire. He spoke English with a thick, syrupy accent. "This is Claire," Alessandro said, wrapping a possessive arm around her waist. The heat of his hand through the silk of her dress was distracting. "Claire, this is Damien Fabrizi, an old associate of my family." "A pleasure, Mr. Fabrizi," Claire said, pitching her voice a little higher, playing the part of the naive American. "Sandro has told me so much about your heritage." Damien chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Sandro is a good boy. Too modern sometimes, but good." He looked past Claire, signaling to two younger men in sharp suits standing a few feet away. Damien seamlessly switched to Italian, but not standard Italian. He dropped into a thick, muddy dialect from the eastern coast of Sicily. It was fast, filled with swallowed consonants and regional slang. "Tutto a posto stanotte?" Damien asked the younger man. "Is everything ready for tonight?" "Sì, Don Mico. I picciotti sono fuori. Un pacchetto arriva a mezzanotte." "Yes, Don Mico. The boys are outside. The package arrives at midnight." Damien nodded, smiling pleasantly at Claire as if he were discussing the weather. "Usheku unisi meti?" "Where is the donkey standing?" Claire's pulse spiked. "Sheku." Donkey. It was a derogatory slang term her grandfather used for someone who was stubborn, proud, and about to be slaughtered. He was talking about Alessandro. The younger man glanced subtly at the large glass double doors leading out to the hotel's private smoking terrace. "Nare a porta di vitro, quando nesci pi fumare, ci tagliamo ucciatu." Behind the glass door. When he goes out to smoke, we cut his breath. Claire felt the blood drain from her face, but she forced herself to take a sip of her champagne, keeping her eyes completely blank. They were going to hit Alessandro tonight. On the terrace, when he went for his customary post-dinner cigarette. Damien turned back to Alessandro, switching effortlessly to English. "It is a beautiful party, Sandro, but I must speak with some of the other board members. We will have a drink later, yes? Perhaps on the terrace, where it is quiet? I look forward to it, Damien, Alessandro said, his face an impenetrable mask. As Damien walked away, Alessandro guided Claire toward a quiet alcove near a massive pillar. Well? He asked quietly. Did they say anything of value? Claire looked up at him. Beneath the cold exterior of the ruthless boss, she realized for the first time that he was mortal. He could bleed. He could be killed. And right now, she held his life in her hands. She could say nothing. She could let Damien Fabrizi execute the man who was holding her mother's medical debt over her head. She would be free. The debt would die with him. She looked at Alessandro's eyes, sharp, assessing, waiting. She remembered the way he had paid the hospital bill without a word, the way he had stepped between her and Baron Carmichael. Never show the wolves that you are bleeding, her grandfather's voice whispered. He called you a donkey, Claire said, her voice barely a breath. Alessandro's eyes narrowed slightly. Go on. He asked his men where you would be standing. They said the boys are outside. The package arrives at midnight. When you go out to the glass terrace to smoke with him? Claire swallowed, her throat dry. They said they're going to cut your breath. Silence stretched between them. The lively jazz music of the gala seemed to fade into a dull roar. Alessandro did not look surprised. He looked disappointed. I see, Alessandro murmured. He didn't pull out a gun. He didn't shout. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, typing a single-letter text message. He slid the phone back into his tuxedo jacket. What are you going to do? Claire asked, her voice trembling. They have men outside. I am going to do what my father taught me, Alessandro said, his hand sliding down to grip hers. His fingers were warm, his grip iron-clad. I am going to burn the house down. Walk with me, Claire. Do not run. Do not look panicked. Smile. He led her away from the alcove, not toward the terrace, but toward the service kitchens. Where are we going? She asked, keeping a strained smile on her face as they passed a group of laughing socialites. We are leaving, Alessandro replied casually. But Damien is waiting for you on the terrace. Damien is waiting for a ghost, Alessandro said coldly. Dante is already moving to secure the terrace. Damien Fabrizi will not live to see midnight. They pushed through the swinging doors into the chaotic heat of the hotel kitchen. Waiters holding trays of seared scallops shouted at each other in Spanish and English. Alessandro moved through the chaos with terrifying authority, pulling Claire along. Suddenly, the heavy metal door at the back of the kitchen, leading to the loading dock, burst open. 2 men in dark suits stepped inside. They were not hotel staff. They were Damien's men. One of them reached inside his jacket. Alessandro didn't hesitate. He shoved Claire hard to the left, behind a massive stainless steel preparation table, just as the first shot rang out. The sound was deafening in the tiled kitchen. A stack of porcelain plates shattered into dust above Claire's head. Screams erupted from the kitchen staff as they scattered, diving for cover. Claire covered her ears, pressing herself against the cold tile floor, her emerald dress soaking up a spilled pool of duck sauce. She looked up. Terrified, Alessandro had not ducked. He moved with the terrifying speed of a striking viper. He closed the distance between himself and the shooters before they could re-aim. He grabbed the wrist of the first gunman, twisting it upward with a sickening snap, and drove his elbow into the man's throat. As the first man collapsed, Alessandro smoothly drew a suppressed pistol from his own waistband, aimed at the second man, and fired twice. Puffed. Puffed. The second man slumped backward into a stack of flour sacks, dead before he hit the ground. The entire sequence took less than 4 seconds. The kitchen was plunged into a horrified, echoing silence. punctuated only by the sobbing of a pastry chef hiding in the pantry. Alessandro stood over the bodies, his breathing perfectly even, his tuxedo unwrinkled. He holstered his weapon and turned his head to look at Claire behind the prep table. The cold, aristocratic mask was completely gone, replaced by the raw, brutal reality of the Sicilian underworld. He walked over to her, his polished shoes crunching on broken porcelain. He extended a hand, the same hand that had just ended a life, and offered it to her. "Come, Pichirida," Alessandro said, his voice dropping back into the ancient, guttural dialect of their ancestors. "Uscravagiu è morto. Ora, ni scappamu. The beetle is dead. Now we run." Claire looked at his hand. She looked at the blood pooling on the kitchen floor. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She reached up and placed her hand in his. The escape from the Pierre Hotel was a blur of cold rain, screaming sirens in the distance, and the terrifying, silent efficiency of Alessandro's men. Dante was already idling an armored black SUV in the service alley. Alessandro practically threw Claire into the back seat before sliding in beside her, the heavy, reinforced door slamming shut with the finality of a vault. They did not speak as the vehicle tore out of Manhattan, weaving through the slick, rain-swept streets toward the George Washington Bridge. Claire sat paralyzed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring at the small, dark stains on the hem of her ruined emerald gown. It wasn't duck sauce, it was blood. Hours seemed to evaporate. When the SUV finally crunched to a halt, they were deep in the Hudson Valley, hidden behind the high iron gates of the Whitmore estate, a sprawling, fortified stone manor registered under a shell corporation. Inside, the house was dark, smelling of wood smoke and old leather. Dante disappeared to secure the perimeter, leaving Claire and Alessandro alone in the cavernous library. The adrenaline that had kept Claire upright finally shattered. She collapsed onto a Chesterfield sofa, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. She wasn't crying, she was hyperventilating, the sheer, brutal reality of the violence she had just witnessed crashing down on her. "Breathe, Claire," Alessandro said. His voice was no longer the icy command of a syndicate boss. It was low, rough, and surprisingly gentle. He knelt on the Persian rug in front of her, uncapping a crystal decanter of bourbon and pouring a measure into a glass. He pressed it into her trembling hands. "Drink. It will stop the shaking." Claire took a breathless gulp. The alcohol burned a harsh, grounding path down her throat. She lowered the glass and looked at him. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket and unbuttoned his collar. The lethal predator from the hotel kitchen was gone, replaced by a man looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You killed them," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "I protected what is mine," Alessandro corrected softly, his dark eyes tracing the pale lines of her face. Damien made his move. He thought I was blinded by a pretty face. He did not realize that the pretty face was the one holding the knife. I didn't hold a knife. I just listened. "In my world, information is a blade," he murmured, reaching out. His warm fingers brushed a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear, lingering against her jawline. The touch sent a shock wave of heat through her shivering body. "You saved my life tonight, Pichirida. If you had not translated Damien's dialect, I would be bleeding out on that terrace." "Why did you bring me here?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "You have your wiretap. You survived." "Let me go." Alessandro's hand slid from her jaw to the nape of her neck, his thumb resting against her racing pulse. "Do you truly want to go back, Claire? Back to the fluorescent lights, the aching feet, and the men in cheap suits who look right through you. You stepped into the fire tonight, and you did not burn. You glowed. The space between them vanished. The simmering, unspoken tension that had begun the moment she spoke Sicilian to him in the restaurant finally broke. Alessandro leaned in, and Claire did not pull away. When his lips met hers, it was not a gentle collision. It was a desperate, consuming fire, fueled by the adrenaline of survival and the intoxicating pull of absolute power. She kissed him back, her hands tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the only solid thing in a world that had just been turned upside down. 3 days passed in the isolation of the Whitmore estate. In the outside world, the sudden, violent death of Damien Fabrizi sent shockwaves through the East Coast syndicates. But inside the stone walls, Alessandro orchestrated a ruthless, bloodless coup over the phone, consolidating his power and stripping Damien's loyalists of their assets. On the 4th morning, Claire found Alessandro in his study. He was sitting behind a massive oak desk, an old, cracked leather ledger open before him. "Sit down, Claire," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the yellowed pages. She took the seat opposite him, a knot tightening in her stomach. The intimacy of the past 3 days suddenly felt fragile, overshadowed by the looming spectre of her grandfather's debt. "I told you that Vincenzo Rossi stole $3 million from my father and fled," Alessandro began, his voice devoid of emotion. "That is the story my family believed for 32 years. It is the reason you were brought to my table." Claire braced herself, waiting for the final demand. Alessandro slowly turned the ledger around, sliding it across the polished wood toward her. The pages were filled with meticulous, handwritten accounting, detailing shipments, payouts, and bribes from the early 90s. "After the gala, my men raided Damien's private safe in Brooklyn," Alessandro continued. "We found this. It is Damien's personal ledger from 1994. He pointed to a line near the bottom of the page. "Read the notation." Claire leaned forward. Her grandfather had taught her to read the old dialect as well as speak it. She traced the faded ink. "Li sordi pigliati. U cieco vecchio è fottuto. U caruso rossi si piglia a curpa." Claire translated it in her head, her heart stopping. "The money taken. The old donkey is fucked. The Rossi boy takes the blame." She looked up at Alessandro, her eyes wide with shock. "Damien took the money. He framed my grandfather. Damien orchestrated the theft to bankrupt my father and trigger a war," Alessandro said, his jaw tightening with retrospective fury. "Vincenzo Rossi discovered the plot. He couldn't prove it, and he knew Damien would kill my father and his entire family, including me, a child at the time, to cover his tracks. So your grandfather took the blame. He drew Damien's assassins away from Palermo, fled to America, and lived the rest of his life in exile, branded a traitor, to save my family." Tears pricked Claire's eyes. The quiet, sad man who baked bread in Queens had not been a thief. He had been a shield. He had sacrificed his honor and his homeland to protect a bloodline. Alessandro stood up, walked around the desk, and produced a thick manila envelope, placing it gently in front of her. Inside is a new passport, a deed to a villa in Tuscany under a clean name, and an offshore account with $3 million, the money my family owes the Rossi bloodline for saving our lives, Alessandro said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The debt is cleared, Claire. You are a free woman. Dante is waiting outside to take you to the airport. You never have to look over your shoulder again." Claire stared at the envelope. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. Freedom, security, peace. She looked up at Alessandro. He was standing perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, his aristocratic face an unreadable mask. but Claire had learned to read the subtle shifts in his armor. She saw the microscopic tension in his shoulders, the dark, waiting abyss in his eyes. He was giving her an out, but it was tearing him apart to do it. "And if I leave?" Claire asked, her voice steady. "Who will translate the whispers in the dark for you? Who will watch your back when the next Damien smiles in your face?" Alessandro stepped closer, resting his hands on the arms of her chair, trapping her in his intoxicating gravity. "If you stay," he murmured, his accent thickening into the dangerous cadence of their shared ancestors, "you will never leave. You will not be a waitress. You will not be a pawn. You will be my partner. You will rule beside me, and the world will learn to fear the name Rossi, just as they fear Conti." Claire looked at the envelope. Then she looked at the ledger, the proof of her grandfather's ultimate bloody sacrifice. She had spent her entire life hiding, serving, making herself small to survive. But the fire of Palermo ran in her veins, and she finally understood the language it spoke. Slowly, deliberately, Claire picked up the envelope and tossed it into the roaring fireplace behind the desk. The paper caught instantly, curling into ash. She stood up, closing the distance between them until she could feel the steady, heavy thud of his heartbeat. She looked up into the eyes of the most dangerous man in New York, a fierce, unapologetic smile curving her lips. "Allura," Claire whispered in perfect ancient Sicilian, "fammici abituare a sta corona." "Then let me get used to this crown." Alessandro's eyes blazed with a triumphant, terrifying light. He pulled her against him, sealing the pact not with a contract, but with a kiss that promised empires. At dinner, no one understood the Sicilian Mafia boss. Until the Waitress spoke his language is a story about the inescapable gravity of one's roots. Claire Rossi believed she was just a struggling New Yorker, entirely disconnected from the violent, shadowed history of her family. Yet it was a single, ancient dialect, a whispered inheritance that bridged two disparate worlds, transforming her from a forgotten server into a formidable queen of the syndicate. Alessandro Conti, a man who built an empire on silence and fear, found his equal not in a boardroom, but in the fierce loyalty of a woman who understood his truest voice. Ultimately, the tale reminds us that true power does not lie in wealth or intimidation, but in the hidden languages we carry, the sacrifices of those who came before us, and the courage to claim our rightful place when destiny finally calls our name.